Well, the whole world's in a flap about Stephen Hawking having been associated with Epstein. My advice to you is get used to it. There are so many famous people who have dark corners of their lives we never heard about because their inheritors destroyed their letters. That's not possible now. I'm Granny Opterix. All right, it's difficult what to make of this. Stephen Hawking accepted an invitation for a barbecue on Epstein's Island, as far as I can make out. As far as anyone was concerned when he was associated with Epstein or when he went to visit his island, Epstein would have been a very rich hedge fund manager, or whatever he said he was, which he probably wasn't, but that's another matter. Why shouldn't Hawking accept an invitation from him? And why should this be a thing anyway? It says here, Stephen Hawking, flawed genius, wound up in the Epstein scandal. He's not a flawed genius. He's a genius. That's all. As for the man Stephen Hawking, he's as flawed as any other man, but he's not a flawed genius. As a national treasure, Professor Stephen Hawking ticked almost every box. He'd become a timeless hero. You know, that's the problem. We often, if we look at history books, we see people who are great heroes. Then when we go into it a bit more, we discover that they were probably not very nice people. But that's the way it's been throughout history. The problem is it's now on the internet, whereas it wasn't before. He changed our understanding of the universe and achieved a rare status in British public life of a celebrity theoretical physicist. So for many, it would have come as a shock to find his name in the Epstein files. Pretty soon they're going to be blaming people for passing other nasty people in the street. Oh, by the way, I want to say that Trump banned Epstein from his club and refused to go to his island. Trump knew more about him. I shouldn't think that Hawking knew that much about him, except that he was very rich and had an island. We already knew of some association between Prof. Hawking and Epstein. In 2015, photographs emerged of the physicist visiting Epstein's Caribbean island in March 2006 as part of a trip to a nearby conference. So Hawking was going to a conference along with a lot of other luminaries of the physics world, and Epstein saw his chance and invited him over. The conference, attended by 20 other scientists, was funded by Epstein. Okay, so he said, look, I'm funding this, why don't you come over? Probably knowing that he could then say to other people he wanted to attract, well, you know, Stephen Hawking's here. Who would miss a chance to meet the great professor? And then right down here, so let's see how far down we are. Here's the article. And then you've got to read through all of this and the adverts. And you get, there is no accusation of any wrongdoing. So he was on the island, and that's enough to shock people and stain Hawking's reputation forever, even when there is no accusation of any wrongdoing. The picture showed him having a barbecue and taking a boat cruise and submarine tour. You know what? Why shouldn't he? And how much would he have known about Epstein anyway? Now, hardly anybody outside that circle. Now, I know that politicians and people in the upper circles of society might have known there was something odd about Epstein. I do know that Trump actually refused to go to the island and kicked him out of Mar-a-Lago. He he stopped Epstein from becoming a member, or he actually told him to leave, something like that, because he knew there was something dodgy about it. Unlike the Clintons, that's another matter. But what would someone like Stephen Hawking know about this? And you get invited out to an island for a barbecue and a submarine tour. What are you supposed to think? Oh no, in 20 years' time they're going to discover he was involved in some dodgy practices. Anyway, I just thought I might take the opportunity to remind people that this is now the age of the internet, and we're going to know more about our heroes than we ever did in previous centuries. And here I'm going to talk about Abdul Karim. He was engaged as a secretary to Queen Victoria, and she became very fond of him in a motherly sort of way. And she took care of him. And she even, although he was kicked out of Buck House and all the other royal residences and told to get back to India after the Queen died, she had already arranged a home for him in India. So he lived in comparative comfort until his rather unfortunately early death. But it says here, he was known as the Munshi, and apparently that means the teacher. He was an Indian attendant of Queen Victoria and served her during the final 14 years of her reign. And he had a close platonic relationship with her. And after the Queen died, her son had not only had him ejected forthwith from his apartments in the palace, but they had all the documentation between Victoria and him burnt. So we are never sure of the relationship those people had. And that was possible in those days because all we had was the written word. So nothing got out, and his memory was suppressed. I suppose the royal family were very jealous of him because the Queen wasn't that maternal to her own children, and then in her final years, she became very maternal to this guy. And then there was, that was one thing. And then there was Victoria's daughter, Princess Beatrice. She was Victoria's literary executor and went through all of the Queen's journals, cutting out things she didn't like. So we don't know. And then she destroyed stuff. She'd transcribe the diaries and then burn the originals. So we never know. This is a transcription somebody made of an original diary, and this is what Beatrice had written. So here we have this. This is what Queen Victoria says. Got up at 20 minutes to 9, my dearest Albert put on my stockings for me. I went in and saw him shave, a great delight for me. We breakfasted at 9:30 together, wrote to Lord M, that'll be Melbourne, in A's room, Albert's room, sang to him, dressed and etc. I passed through the middle room where Lord Melbourne was with Albert, wrote my journal, and I went to see Ma. Okay. And this is what Princess Beatrice had of that beginning there. We went to see Mama after breakfast and I wrote my journal. Before, dearest Albert drove me out in the pony phaeton, the ladies following in carriages. You know, all that stuff about stockings and shaving, she got rid of it. But that's what people could do in those days. There's a very famous example of literary disaster. Probably it's been called the worst thing that happened in English letters in our entire history, and that was Isabel Burton, the wife of Richard Burton. No, not that Richard Burton, the 19th century explorer. And he was particularly open-minded, was Richard Burton, both in respect of 19th century morals and 19th century marriage. And she was a very intelligent woman, but she did an awful thing best known for burning his papers and manuscripts after his death, including the revised translation of The Perfumed Garden, which was to be called The Scented Garden. And so he spent years translating and rewriting and polishing, and she burnt it all because she thought it was immoral. And she was a good Catholic. His wife, fearful lest her husband be thought vicious because he collected data on what Victorian England called vice, at once burnt the projected new edition of The Perfumed Garden he had been annotating. She then wrote a biography of Burton in which she tried to fashion the Rabelaisian scholar's adventure into a good Catholic, a faithful husband, and refined and modest man. She rewrote stuff, she cut stuff out, she just took little bits. Afterwards, she burnt almost all of his 40-year collection of diaries and journals. Can you imagine the loss to letters? Because he was an external observer of Victorian society. He would have had a lot of importance to say about it. The loss to history and anthropology was monumental. Okay? Right. But she could do that. That wouldn't happen nowadays because it would all be on the internet. But you see, Burton probably recorded his misdemeanors as well. And people would have been calling him a flawed genius or whatever. And yeah, that's... Look, there's always a good side and a bad side. There's always a flip side. We're always talking about how damaging the internet can be. Well, here's an example of how damaging the lack of an internet was. How much we've lost. Now, we might say we're getting overloaded with stuff now. That's another matter. But, you know, if we'd have been in the years before the internet, then Hawking would have just been a famous physicist and great man of science. Now we know he was on Epstein's island and we can all be shocked about. Well, I'm not shocked. But a lot of people can profess shock. I don't know what it is. There's something about some people who are of such shining use to humanity, of such outstanding quality. In all the billions of people in the world, Hawking stood on his own above everyone in the matter of physics. And there are some people who cannot bear this and will dig any dirt to try and bring him down to earth so that they can feel like there isn't somebody of greater worth than themselves. It's disgraceful. All right, well, till next time. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Granbo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share, share, share.